It began at dawn. Not a calm dawn. Not a gentle, glowing sunrise over Windsor Castle. No, this dawn came with urgency. With footsteps. With locked doors. And with an order so drastic, so unprecedented, that even senior palace officials whispered the same thing under their breath. This ends now. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Let me ask you something. What would force a monarch? A man raised his entire life to follow protocol, timing, order, tradition, to sign emergency documents before the sun even touched the castle lawns. What could possibly be so severe, so explosive, that King Charles III would bypass every usual channel and transfer Camilla's powers directly to Catherine? Most people will tell you this kind of thing doesn't happen. The monarchy is stable, controlled, predictable, but that's the version they present in documentaries and polished interviews. Behind the scenes, it has always been a pressure cooker. And that morning, the lid finally blew off. Now, you might wonder, why Catherine? Why now? Why at dawn of all times? Why with this level of urgency? Those questions matter, because the truth behind them isn't just about royal titles or ceremonial authority. It's about something deeper, something the palace never wanted the public to know. Something that began the night before, in whispers, in harsh words, in an unplanned confrontation that spiraled out of control. But let's not jump ahead yet, because everything that unfolded in the hours leading up to that signature, that dramatic ink on parchment, was already building for months, maybe years. Still, nothing prepared anyone for what happened that morning. Picture this. It's 4:17 a.m. at Windsor. The castle is mostly asleep. Only security teams are active, pacing the corridors, doing their usual rounds. The kitchens are silent. The courtyard still. The air cold. Then, an unheard-of order shakes everything awake. The king demands the presence of the Lord Chamberlain. Immediately. No delays. No explanations. And the staff know what this means. Because when a monarch summons a council at dawn, something has gone very, very wrong. The message spreads quickly through the private corridors like electricity. Emergency session. Now. Servants straighten themselves. Advisors scramble. Phones light up. But no one knows the details. Just that the king looks resolved. Not panicked. Not hesitant. Resolved. That alone terrifies the palace more than any crisis. But here's where things get interesting. Because Catherine, Princess of Wales, is already awake. Already dressed. Already waiting. Not by accident. Not because she's an early riser, but because she had been briefed earlier than anyone else. She had already received the message, or rather, the warning, that something was coming. Something big. And Camilla? She was nowhere to be seen. Now pause for a second. Ask yourself this. How does the queen consort vanish at the exact moment the king prepares to make the most drastic internal decision of his reign? Coincidence? Hardly. Because while Catherine was being escorted into a secure room, Camilla's absence wasn't just inconvenient. It raised suspicion. See, there are moments in royal life when timing is everything. And Camilla's timing that night, her late return, her private calls, her agitation, did not help her. Not in the slightest. But we'll get to that. For now, let's stay in that tense, icy dawn corridor as the king walks toward the council chamber. His expression is unreadable. His steps firm. Two advisors flank him. Notably, neither of them are Camilla's usual allies. A sealed leather folder rests in his hands. Inside it, emergency orders, drafted only hours earlier. Orders that would restructure power at the highest level of the monarchy in a way no one saw coming. And at the center of that restructuring, the woman standing silently in the antechamber, Catherine. Let that settle in. The Princess of Wales. The future queen. The woman who spent years playing the diplomatic, stabilizing role behind the scenes. The woman tabloids once belittled as too quiet, too polished, too soft. Now, she was about to receive sweeping powers, and no one outside that room even knew why. But here's where things take another turn. Just minutes before Charles enters the chamber, the head of palace security approaches him. He leans in. He whispers something. And whatever he says causes Charles to close his eyes, just for a moment, as if he's absorbing a blow. What was that message? Why did it matter? What new information arrived at the worst possible time? That detail. That whispered line, would later become a key piece of the entire puzzle, because it confirmed something Charles had already suspected but hadn't wanted to believe. Now you may be wondering, what could shake the king? What could make him act with this level of urgency? What could cause him to sign away Camilla's influence while the palace still slept? Well, part of that answer lies in the previous night. A night filled with tension, with confrontation, with moments that pushed Charles to the edge of his patience and authority. And part of it lies in a recording. Yes, a recording. One that should never have existed. One that Catherine heard first. One that Charles heard second. One that changed everything. But let's not run ahead too fast. Because before we reach the recording, we need to understand why Charles had already become wary, why Catherine's influence had quietly expanded, and why Camilla's behavior in the days leading up to this crisis raised alarms even among her closest aides. Publicly, the monarchy has always presented unity, a stable front, a family standing together despite headlines, rumors, scandals, and the relentless global spotlight. But privately, the fractures run deeper. There were meetings Catherine attended without Camilla's knowledge. There were briefings where advisors bypassed Camilla entirely and went straight to Catherine because she handles pressure better. There were tensions about public image, about responsibility, about who should speak for the crown in moments of crisis. Camilla had grown increasingly frustrated, Catherine increasingly calm, and Charles increasingly dependent on Catherine's steadiness. What do you think happens when pressure builds like this in a system designed to avoid sudden change? It snaps. And that snapping point was reached at 5:03 a.m., when Charles finally placed his signature on the emergency order. In a single stroke, the balance of power shifted. Camilla was effectively sidelined. Catherine was elevated, and the monarchy entered a new, uncertain chapter. But of course, the public didn't know that yet. Not at dawn. Not during those chaotic minutes when the palace scrambled to reassign duties, reword statements, silence potential leaks, and control what little narrative they could. And here's the chilling part. The staff who witnessed the signing didn't say it felt like a routine administrative task. They said it felt like a storm gathering, like a fuse being lit, like the beginning of something irreversible. They said Charles's eyes looked different, determined, hurt, resolute. They said Catherine looked composed, almost too composed, as if she had been preparing for this for far longer than anyone imagined. They said the atmosphere was so tense that even the clicking of the pen echoed. But here's the twist you're not expecting. This decision wasn't only about Camilla. It wasn't only about Catherine. It wasn't even just about the recording, or the confrontation, or the missing hours. It was about a rule, a hidden clause, a rarely used authority written into royal protocol decades ago, one that gives the monarch emergency power to bypass traditional hierarchy if he believes the stability of the crown is at risk. Charles believed it, and in that moment, he acted. Now let's step back for a second and ask a question the palace hopes no one will ever ask. Why did Charles think the crown was at risk? Because something happened the night before that shook the foundation of trust between him and Camilla. Something that Catherine knew about before anyone else. Something that triggered an emergency meeting, a late-night briefing, and the most dramatic power shift the monarchy has seen in decades. And what exactly was that something? That is where the Real story begins. Because the signing of the Dawn orders wasn't the climax. It wasn't even the turning point. It was merely the consequence. The spark? The catalyst? The true reason Charles acted? That happened hours before. And once you understand what took place, who said what, who heard what, who threatened whom, and who revealed the most unexpected truth, everything suddenly makes sense. Because the truth behind that emergency order is far bigger than a simple power change. It's about betrayal, loyalty, fear, responsibility, political pressure, personal history, and the one moment where everything collided. And that moment is where we go next. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. To truly understand how the monarchy reached this breaking point, we must return to the early hours before dawn, when the final cracks in the royal foundation widened into a full rupture. Around 2:13 a.m., long before the emergency orders were drafted, a private vehicle moved quietly through a side gate of Kensington Palace. No lights, no escort, no announcement. Only a senior intelligence liaison stepping out into the cold, holding a secure case briefed only for two people, the king And Catherine? Why Catherine? That's the question palace watchers will be arguing about for years. But those who were present say she was involved because she had already been monitoring the situation long before it escalated. Because she was the only one Charles trusted to filter sensitive information without emotional bias. Because she had become, in many ways, his stabilizing force, his ruthless voice of reason when the palace landscape grew unstable. But that trust didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was earned, over time, through consistency, through loyalty, and through one quality the monarchy rarely sees anymore: restraint. And ironically, that same restraint is what made Camilla furious. Royal insiders claim the tension between Catherine and Camilla had been simmering for months. Catherine's rising public popularity, her measured approach, her competence, her poise, her ability to maintain dignity even during her own health struggles. It created a silent contrast, one that became impossible to ignore, one that Camilla reportedly found threatening. Now, imagine that tension suddenly erupting in the middle of a crisis. Because that's exactly what happened. While Catherine was quietly ushered into a secure briefing room, Camilla was reportedly engaged in a heated private argument with one of her senior aides, an argument overheard by 2 staff members, one of whom later said, "I've never heard her voice like that." But the content of that argument? That's where things get dark. According to insiders, Camilla had received information, incorrect information, fueled by paranoia, that Catherine was positioning herself to take over certain duties prematurely, that Catherine was being favored in discussions from which Camilla felt excluded, that Catherine had become the preferred royal figure for both public messaging and internal stability. Camilla allegedly believed Catherine was overstepping. But here's the twist. Catherine didn't seek any of this. She wasn't playing politics. She wasn't scheming. She wasn't lobbying for influence. She was simply being competent in a moment of crisis. Sometimes competency is the most threatening weapon of all. So Camilla confronted Charles, angrily, loudly, emotionally, at a time when the king was already overwhelmed with personal health concerns, global obligations, and internal chaos. Marital tension inside Buckingham Palace is nothing new. But this confrontation wasn't private. It wasn't contained. And it didn't happen at a good time. Because while that argument unfolded, Catherine was being shown something that no one, certainly not Camilla, expected her to see. The recording. The one that should not have existed. The one that advisors feared would tear the monarchy apart. The one that triggered the Dawn orders. But before we reach that recording, we must understand the atmosphere leading up to it. By 2:45 a.m., the palace's senior staff were already aware that something had cracked open. Aides were uneasy. Messages were being deleted. Communications were being restricted. Whispered instructions, tense glances, and hurried footsteps filled the hallways. Security tightened. Advisors began preparing contingency plans. A quiet directive went out. No one speaks to the press. Not a single word. This wasn't normal palace anxiety. This was crisis mode. And the king wasn't even in the loop yet, not fully. But Catherine was. That's the detail the public never sees. She wasn't just a bystander. She wasn't just watching events unfold. She was actively processing the situation, asking sharp questions, demanding clarity, and preparing herself for what she suspected was coming. Because unlike most royal drama, this wasn't about image. This wasn't about scandal. This was about the stability of the monarchy itself. At 3:11 a.m., Charles finally received a secure call from the aide assigned to Catherine's briefing. And whatever was relayed in that call made Charles sit up straight in bed. What did he hear? What was said? What was confirmed? Don't worry, we'll get to that in Chapter 2. But for now, know this. Charles did not hesitate. Within minutes, he ordered his senior advisors to prepare an emergency council. He requested specific documents. He demanded access to the secure file Catherine viewed. And he insisted the meeting take place at dawn. No waiting, no delay, no, let's discuss in the morning. This was decisive, unilateral, uncommon. And according to one palace staffer, Charles acted like a man who suddenly knew he had no time left to waste. It's a haunting statement, one that suggests he wasn't just making a leadership decision. He was making a legacy decision. But where was Camilla? That question, the one none of the advisors could answer, hung like a shadow over every move Charles made. Because here's the most unusual part. When the king requested her presence, she wasn't there. She didn't pick up her phone. She didn't respond to staff. She didn't appear in any of the known corridors. She was simply absent. And absence, at a moment like this, is damning. Meanwhile, Catherine was present, patient, focused, silent, watching the palace scramble around her as if she already knew exactly how the morning would end. Some say she looked calm because she expected Charles to act. Others say she was calm because she feared what would happen if he didn't. But almost everyone agrees on one thing. Catherine seemed prepared, too prepared, which raises the question, did she already know what Charles was going to do? Or was she simply bracing herself for the inevitable? As dawn approached, the tension in Windsor Castle became unbearable. Senior advisors stood by with documents in hand. A few argued behind closed doors about whether this could be delayed. Others insisted the king had no choice. One aide reportedly said, "She has forced his hand. He can't ignore it anymore." Was this she referring to Camilla, Catherine, or both? The ambiguity itself reveals the chaos of the moment. But here's where everything converges. Just minutes before Charles signed the emergency transfer order, he received one more message. A quiet, whispered statement from the head of palace security. A statement that changed his face completely. A statement that confirmed the worst suspicion he'd kept to himself. A statement that made the signing not just urgent, but necessary. We don't learn what that whispered message was until later chapters, but knowing it existed is enough to understand why Charles moved the way he did. Immediately afterward, the king entered the council chamber, laid the documents before him, and signed. And in that moment, everything shifted. Power moved. Authority restructured. Roles rewritten. Priorities realigned. And Catherine, calm, steady, unshakable Catherine, became the central pillar of the monarchy's future. But remember this. The emergency order was not a reaction to just one event. It was the culmination of multiple threads unraveling simultaneously. Camilla's escalating tensions. Catherine's quiet rise in responsibility. A missing queen consort at a moment of crisis. A recording impossible to ignore. A confrontation that pushed Charles to the edge. And the whispered truth that shattered his patience. This story is not about favoritism. It's not about royal rivalry. It's not even about personal emotion. It is about a monarchy on the brink of internal collapse and the desperate actions taken to pull it back from the edge. And now that you know how the dawn began, it's time to trace the steps that led there. Because the night before the emergency order was signed, something happened that changed the royal landscape forever. And what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. The strange thing about that morning was how quiet it felt. Not peaceful, not serene, just quiet. A silence that didn't belong in a palace where staff normally moved like clockwork, where footsteps echoed through polished hallways, where traditions dictated every minute of the day. But at 4:47 a.m., Windsor Castle felt frozen, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. And in the middle of that silence, King Charles stood at a long oak table, staring down at a set of documents that would reshape the monarchy with a single signature. These were not ordinary documents, not briefings, not ceremonial notices, not amendments filtered through committees or polished by advisors. These were emergency orders, drafted quickly, digitally sealed, printed under secure protocol, delivered to Charles by a courier who looked like he hadn't slept in 2 days. Let me ask you something. Have you ever felt a moment where you knew that if you didn't act right then, everything around you would collapse? That if you waited even one more hour, the damage would be irreversible? That is the moment Charles found himself in. Advisors tried to hide it, but witnesses said his hands trembled slightly when he first opened the folder. Not from weakness, not from hesitation, but from the weight of what was inside. Because each page represented a decision the monarchy had never wanted to face. At the top of the first document was a stark line. Royal Emergency Directive 7B, Transfer of Operational Duties and Representative Powers. And beneath that, the line that sent chills through Windsor. Effective immediately by the authority vested in the sovereign, select powers assigned to the Queen Consort shall be reassigned to the Princess of Wales. Imagine reading that. Imagine being the one who had to sign it. Imagine knowing that history would judge you, for better or worse, based on this moment. But let's take a step back. How does a king reach the point where he's signing emergency measures at dawn? Why bypass the queen consort? Why elevate Catherine? Why now? To answer that, we need to look at the room. Picture it. A long chamber lined with portraits of monarchs who ruled with steely resolve. Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, George VI. Their painted eyes watching, judging. The air stiff with tradition and expectations. A heavy wooden chair at the head of the table. The king's chair, still slightly warm from Charles sitting there moments ago. Around him stood his closest advisors. The Lord Chamberlain, the private secretary, 2 intelligence liaisons, a clerk to record timestamps, a legal officer holding a secondary copy of the order. Notice who isn't there. No Camilla, no William, no Anne, no public-facing royals at all. This wasn't a family meeting. This wasn't a discussion. This wasn't a negotiation. This was execution. Because by the time the documents reached the table, the decision was already made. One of the senior advisors, a man who had served 3 monarchs, later said quietly, "I knew it was over when I saw his eyes." He had already crossed the bridge. But what bridge? What line did Charles cross before dawn? What truth had solidified in his mind? We'll get there. For now, picture the moment the clock hit 5:03 a.m. Charles, still in a tailored but slightly wrinkled morning suit, placed both hands on the table. He leaned forward. He pressed his thumb into the wax seal that had been broken only minutes earlier. And he signed. One clean signature. No pauses. No reconsideration. No requests for delay. Just ink. On paper. On history. The room remained silent. Then something unexpected happened. Charles closed the pen, placed it down gently, and whispered something. Not loudly. Not to the entire room. Just to the Lord Chamberlain. Only one staff member heard it clearly. It cannot continue. Not like this. 5 simple words. But each one carried the weight of a kingdom. And the question that followed, the one his advisors dared not ask, was, what exactly could not continue? Was he referring to Camilla's behavior the night before? Her escalating tension? Her emotional volatility? The information Catherine had received? The recording? The confrontation? The disappearance? Or the greater danger none of them had publicly acknowledged yet? Here's where things get even more intriguing. Once the documents were signed, standard protocol demanded that duplicate copies be archived. Normally, this is done automatically. Procedure, order, routine. But Charles did something that startled even his most seasoned officials. He personally held onto the copies. All of them. He refused to let the clerk take them. He refused to let them be sent to the secure archive. He refused to let anyone else touch them. He looked every person in the room directly in the eye and said, "These remain with me." Why? Why keep them close? Why break tradition? Why fear letting those papers leave his sight? Did he fear interception? Leak? Sabotage? Denial? Obstruction? Something had shaken him deeply. Something had told him that this decision, this signature, needed to remain fully in his control. But what was the trigger? The answer lies in what happened next. At 5:11 a.m., Charles asked his advisors a question that sent shivers through those present. Is she aware? But which she? That's the million-dollar mystery. Was he asking if Camilla knew? If Catherine knew? If someone else, someone unnamed, had been informed? The private secretary responded quietly. Only the Princess of Wales has been briefed. Charles nodded. He didn't ask about Camilla again. Not once. This was another moment that signaled something far deeper than a mere administrative shift. When a king signs a document stripping his wife of operational authority, even temporarily, and doesn't ask about her, you know something fractured beyond repair. Now let's talk about Catherine. While the signing was happening, Catherine wasn't pacing. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't emotional. Witnesses say she stood with her hands clasped in front of her, her expression calm but unreadable, her posture perfect, her breathing steady. Not cold, not detached, just composed. Too composed, as if she had already rehearsed this moment in her mind. As if she knew that sooner or later, this day would come. As if she had stepped into a role she never asked for, but accepted with dignity because there was no alternative. And the king saw it. He saw the steadiness, the discipline, the calm, the readiness. He saw a future monarch. But here's a detail the palace didn't expect to leak. Catherine didn't look triumphant. She didn't look relieved. She didn't look vindicated. She looked concerned, deeply concerned, not for herself, but for the king. And that is what Charles needed most in that moment. Someone who wasn't thinking about power, titles, media, or position. Someone who cared about him as a man, not as a monarch. This is what many miss about this story. The emergency order wasn't born solely from scandal or conflict. It was born from trust, from clarity, from a crisis that demanded level-headed authority. Catherine had it. Camilla did not. And Charles saw the difference in the harshest possible light. But let's look closer at the documents themselves. The emergency order contained 3 primary points, all of which carried heavy implications. First, Catherine would assume responsibility for overseeing key ceremonial duties in the king's absence. Second, she would have final say on matters regarding public engagements, messaging, and representation. Third, she would be the primary royal figure consulted for national and diplomatic briefings during sensitive periods. These were not symbolic. These were real powers. Powers that shaped the monarchy's public face, stability, and internal hierarchy. And Charles didn't assign them to the queen consort. He assigned them to his daughter-in-law. That alone signals a tectonic shift. But the most controversial clause was the unofficial one, the one whispered quietly among staff. Catherine would temporarily act as the monarchy's stabilizing anchor, a role typically reserved for the queen consort, a role Camilla no longer held. So now we return to the central question. Why? Why would Charles choose such a dramatic course of action? Why risk scandal, division, backlash, headlines, and internal warfare? Because something had happened that convinced him the future of the monarchy depended on Catherine. Something that shattered his confidence in Camilla. Something that rattled him so deeply that he saw no alternative. And the truth is, that something didn't come from Catherine. It didn't come from Charles. It didn't even come from an advisor. It came from a source no one expected. From the recording. The one piece of evidence that changed everything. But what exactly was on that recording? What did Charles hear? What words triggered the Dawn documents? What secret forced a king to bypass his queen? That answer lies in the hours leading up to the signing. And that story begins in Chapter 2. Because if the dawn was shocking, the night before was far worse. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Here's the uncomfortable truth the palace never wanted to admit. Dawn emergencies don't come out of nowhere. They're born the night before, quietly, slowly, through a series of events that start small, but end up forming a chain reaction no one can stop. And the night before Charles signed the Dawn documents was one of the most chaotic nights the monarchy has faced in decades. It started calmly enough. Or at least, that's what the official schedule said. A private dinner. A routine meeting. A quiet evening. Nothing unusual. Nothing alarming. Nothing to suggest the royal household was about to enter DEFCON 1. But behind closed doors, the tension had already begun tightening like a rope pulled too taut. It began around 6:40 p.m., when an unexpected message arrived for Catherine. A message delivered through a route normally reserved for top-level national security alerts. A message so confidential it bypassed the usual protocol and was handed to her directly by a liaison she had met only twice before. The moment she read it, her expression changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that panicked anyone, but something shifted. Her shoulders squared. Her tone sharpened. She excused herself from the room with a quiet, "I need a moment." That's when the night went off script. Around the same time, on the other side of the palace, Camilla was returning from a private engagement, noticeably irritated. Her driver later reported she had been on a call during most of the ride back, an angry one. Her voice was raised. Her tone clipped. At one point, she reportedly said, "She thinks she can go around me. Not this time." Who is she? We can make our guesses. But the tension was already building long before the two women even crossed paths that night. And now we arrive at the moment where the spark met the fuse. At exactly 7:12 p.m., a junior aide accidentally overheard a heated argument. Camilla and one of her own senior staff members locked in a verbal battle behind a partially closed office door. The aide didn't intend to eavesdrop, but the door swung open slightly, and the voices carried. Camilla said something that stunned the staffer. Something no one expected the queen consort to admit. She is becoming a problem, and Charles is too blind to see it. Again, who was she? Catherine? Another royal? Someone else? The ambiguity made it worse. And the timing? Infinitely worse. Because at that exact moment, Charles himself was still in his private study, preparing materials for a meeting later that evening, unaware that multiple storms were brewing simultaneously. At 8:05 p.m., Catherine received a second message, this one flagged as immediate. Her face reportedly turned pale. Not from fright, from realization. She asked to speak to the king in private, but Charles wasn't available. He was conferring with advisors. So Catherine waited, not impatiently, not anxiously, just quietly, as if she sensed what was coming. Meanwhile, Camilla's agitation grew louder. She began requesting meetings with staff. She demanded clarity about certain decisions being made without her approval. She complained that she was being left out of conversations. This wasn't the usual palace tension. This was something else, something deeper, something raw. By 9:15 p.m., the palace was buzzing. Not outwardly, not publicly, but staff running subtle damage control are experts at spotting when something has gone off the rails. Whispers in corridors, sudden closed doors, rushed messages between advisors, security staff quietly repositioning themselves. These are the signs that the public never sees. Signs that say something big is happening. At 9:43 p.m., Charles finally finished his earlier meeting. His private secretary informed him that Catherine had requested an urgent audience. Charles immediately said yes. That decision changed the course of the night. Because when Catherine entered his study, alone, composed, holding only a single secure envelope, Charles saw something in her expression he hadn't seen before. A seriousness, a resolve, a quiet warning. She handed him the envelope. He opened it. He read the contents once, then twice. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't panic. He simply said, "Is this confirmed?" Catherine nodded. That was the moment everything shifted. The king sat in silence for nearly a full minute. He wasn't frozen. He was processing, calculating, understanding the scale of what he had just been told. He didn't speak again until he said, "Does she know?" Catherine didn't answer immediately, but her silence said enough. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to Charles, Camilla was on the move. She had just left her apartment, her footsteps sharp, quick, and unmistakably angry. She was demanding to see her husband. She had no idea that Catherine had just briefed him on something that would ripple through the monarchy like a shockwave. At 10:17 p.m., Camilla reached the king's private corridor. But she was stopped. Political aides were inside. Security was tightening. Conversations were happening that she wasn't meant to hear. She didn't like that. She didn't like it at all. She snapped at a staffer who tried to explain the situation. She insisted on entering the room. She was told to wait. And Camilla never waits. She stormed away, straight to her own office, straight into another argument with her staff, straight into a spiral that would only worsen as the night progressed. But this is where the real turning point happened, the moment that triggered the emergency. At 10:44 p.m., Charles was handed a secure phone. A call from a high-level advisor who had been monitoring developments elsewhere. The advisor said one sentence that froze the king mid-breath. "It's been verified. Verified. Confirmed. No room for doubt." Whatever Catherine had shown him wasn't speculation. It wasn't rumor. It wasn't exaggerated. It was real. And Camilla still didn't know. Now imagine a monarch absorbing that. Imagine the weight, the implications, the consequences. Imagine realizing that the person you trust and the person you rely on are no longer aligned. Charles asked the advisor a second question. A simple one, but his voice reportedly shook. "Where is she now?" The answer? "We don't know." That single line would throw the palace into chaos. Camilla was missing. Not missing in a dangerous way. Missing in an unaccounted-for way. A way that raised red flags at exactly the wrong time. Staff began searching. Security reviewed cameras. Aides checked her usual rooms. No sign. And this is when the night turned into a thriller. Because at 11:32 p.m., Catherine was shown something she wasn't expecting. The recording. A recording that captured a private conversation. A conversation involving someone close to Camilla. A conversation that contained problematic statements. Statements that suggested volatility. Statements that suggested potential manipulation. Statements that hinted at something far more serious than personal conflict. Catherine didn't react outwardly. She simply said, "The king needs to hear this." But Charles wasn't ready yet. He was still trying to locate his wife. And then, at 11:57 p.m., Camilla finally reappeared. Not calm, Not apologetic. Not collected. No. She was furious. She marched straight toward Charles's study. She demanded access. She demanded answers. She demanded to know what was being hidden from her. And the confrontation exploded. Inside that room, voices rose. Words were exchanged. Tempers flared. Charles, already emotionally exhausted, said something blunt, something that shocked Camilla into silence. I have serious concerns. That line, that single line, was the emotional break. Camilla didn't respond rationally. She lashed out. She accused everyone of conspiring against her. She accused Catherine of manipulating the narrative. She accused the staff of withholding information. And then she said something that sealed her fate. If she thinks she's taking my place, she's mistaken. The she, of course, was Catherine. That accusation, spoken in anger at the worst possible moment, confirmed to the king that Camilla was reacting emotionally, not strategically, at a time when clear judgment was needed most. From that point forward, things unraveled fast. Charles walked out of the conversation. He instructed staff to retrieve the recording. He listened to it alone, and his reaction was immediate. He ordered an emergency council. He ordered the preparation of documents. He demanded Catherine be briefed. He instructed that Camilla be left uninformed until the morning, because the king had made up his mind. By midnight, the palace was in full crisis mode. By 2 a.m., intelligence liaisons were entering the building. By 3 a.m., drafts were being written. By 4 a.m., the documents were finalized. By dawn, they were signed. But this chapter ends with the moment everything crystallized into certainty. When Charles heard the recording, when he understood exactly what had been happening behind his back, when he realized the monarchy was at risk, and when he knew, without doubt, that only one person could stabilize the situation, Catherine. But what exactly was in that recording? Who was speaking? What was said? Why did it shake the king so deeply? The full truth lies ahead. Because the recording didn't just confirm his fears, it exposed far more than anyone expected. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The moment Charles pressed play on that recording, the palace shifted into a different reality. Because this wasn't just gossip, wasn't just speculation, wasn't just a heated moment captured by accident. This was evidence. And evidence is something a monarch cannot ignore. Picture Charles sitting alone in his private study. The room dimly lit. The curtains drawn. The air tense. The weight of the crown pressing down harder than ever. He pushes the play button. At first, the audio is muffled. Two voices speaking quietly. One of them familiar, too familiar. Someone deeply embedded in Camilla's circle. Someone she trusted. And the tone of the conversation is wrong. Not just inappropriate. Not just emotional. Wrong. Because it's laced with something Charles cannot abide. Dismissiveness, manipulation, strategy. And worse, implications about undermining certain royal duties and individuals. The line that reportedly made Charles freeze was this one. She'll never see it coming. She still believes she's untouchable. Let her think that. Now ask yourself, who, in the royal household, could possibly be described as untouchable? Who fits that description? Who was the target of this conversation? There's only one answer. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, the future queen. The woman Charles trusted more than anyone else in the family at that moment. The recording continued. More comments. More implications. A tone of strategic hostility, not against the crown, but against internal figures. And here's the detail no one outside that palace was ever meant to know. This wasn't a discussion about public image, or press strategy, or managing royal engagements. This was personal. It was about influence, about positioning, about whether Catherine was becoming dangerously popular, about whether her rising profile needed to be checked. Whoever was speaking, and palace insiders are certain it was someone within Camilla's inner circle, said things that suggested more than frustration. It suggested sabotage. And when the king heard that line, she'll never see it coming, something snapped inside him. This was no longer palace drama, no longer rivalry, no longer tension. This was a threat to the unity and credibility of the monarchy. Charles pressed pause, sat back, and reportedly whispered, "How dare they?" He wasn't just angry. He was betrayed, not by Catherine, but by someone who should never have allowed such a conversation to take place. He pressed play again. There was more. Comments about controlling the narrative. Comments about Catherine being protected by public sympathy. Comments that insisted the king doesn't see her clearly because he's blinded by her image. This wasn't harmless gossip. This was political maneuvering. Inside the monarchy, against the Princess of Wales, during a time of great national sensitivity. The worst part? The voice speaking wasn't the only one in the room. There was another voice, quieter, but unmistakable. Someone agreeing. Someone close. Someone who shouldn't have been participating in such a conversation at all. That second voice. It belonged to an aide who reported directly to Camilla. That was the breaking point. Because in the monarchy, aides don't act alone. They reflect the tone set by the person they serve. Their behavior echoes the priorities of their superior. Which means, at minimum, Camilla had created a space where such tactics were possible. At worst, she had allowed them, encouraged them, or even supported them. Charles didn't know which possibility was true. He only knew this. Something had spiraled far beyond what he believed was acceptable. And Catherine? She had been the target. Unprovoked. Unwarranted. And in that moment, Charles knew he needed to protect her. Not because she asked for protection, not because she demanded it, but because she had done nothing to deserve the hostility. Now here's where the story takes a darker turn. While Charles was absorbing the implications of what he heard, Camilla was still furious, still pacing, still ranting to staff, still insisting that she was being sidelined. Her emotions, her anger, her paranoia, all peaking at the worst possible moment. She had no idea that the king now possessed information that painted her circle in a dangerous light. She had no idea that the recording Catherine received had just become the final domino. She had no idea that the king had decided, silently, but firmly, that drastic action was required. But something else happened that night. Something that sealed Charles's decision beyond any doubt. At 12:42 a.m., shortly after Charles heard the recording, he requested an immediate briefing document from a trusted legal advisor. The advisor hesitated, not because he doubted the king, but because the request was unusual. The king asked, "Show me every protocol related to emergency reassignment of duties." Let that sink in. Charles wasn't just angry. He was preparing for action, preparing for fallout, preparing for confrontation, preparing for a shift so significant that he needed to understand every line of authority before invoking it. And that's when he was shown a clause no one had reviewed in decades. A clause originally created to protect the monarchy in case of instability within the royal hierarchy. The clause that allowed him to bypass the queen consort. The clause that permitted him to appoint a stabilizing figure. The clause that required only one condition. The king must believe the crown itself is at risk. Did he? Yes. After hearing that recording, absolutely. Now here is the moment that pushed the night from tense to dangerous. At 1:03 a.m., Camilla tried to call someone. Not a family member. Not a staffer. Not a friend. No. She attempted to call someone external. Someone the palace would later classify as a concerning contact. The call was routed through a secure line. It was flagged. It raised alarms instantly, and Charles was informed of it. He didn't react with anger. He reacted with fear. Not fear of Camilla. Fear of what she might say. Fear of what information she might share. Fear of what actions she might take if she felt cornered. What did she say on that call? We may never know. That detail is locked behind layers of palace security. But here's what we do know. The call lasted 5 minutes. It ended abruptly, and it triggered the king's next move. He ordered, no external communications. Block all outgoing calls from her wing. That level of restriction? It has never been used on a senior royal in modern history. Staff panicked. Security tightened. The palace descended into controlled chaos. Meanwhile, Catherine was escorted to a secure meeting room for another briefing. Not because she requested it, but because the king insisted. He wanted her fully informed. He wanted her prepared. He wanted her ready. Because Charles knew what he was about to do next would change her life permanently. At 2:13 a.m., the king finally asked Catherine the question that confirmed his decision. Can you handle what comes after this? It wasn't a question of capability. It was a question of willingness, responsibility, sacrifice. Catherine answered with 6 words. I will do what is needed. And that answer was enough. But here's a detail that will haunt this story forever. At this exact moment, the moment Catherine committed to the role fate had forced upon her, Camilla was in her private quarters, unaware that the future of her own influence was being decided in real time. It wasn't until 2:48 a.m. that security realized something else. Camilla had disappeared again. Her phone was off. Her rooms were empty. Her usual staff couldn't locate her. She wasn't in the palace. She wasn't in any of the monitored areas. She was simply gone. For 37 minutes, the queen consort was unaccounted for. And that was enough for Charles. Enough to classify the situation as unstable. Enough to trigger the emergency directive. Enough to justify the Dawn documents. At 3:20 a.m., the king gave the order. Prepare the transfer. Those 3 words changed history. And everything after that, drafting documents, summoning advisors, coordinating security, briefing Catherine, and preparing the royal household for impact, was simply logistics. But the emotional decision? That happened the moment Charles realized he no longer recognized his wife. And the political decision? That happened the moment he heard the recording. And the strategic decision? That happened the moment Camilla made that external call. By the time the sun began to rise, the wheels were already turning. Catherine was being positioned. Camilla was being sidelined. And the king was about to do something unprecedented. But before he could sign those documents, he had to confront one final question. Who leaked the recording? Who captured the conversation? Who delivered it to Catherine? Who risked their position to expose the truth? Because that person wasn't just a witness. They were a catalyst, and their identity would blow the doors off what really happened. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. There are moments in royal history that get whispered about for decades. Moments that never make it into documentaries or official biographies. Moments that are too explosive, too damaging, too destabilizing to ever be acknowledged publicly. This is one of those moments. Because the recording that Catherine listened to, the one that turned her expression cold and made Charles's face drain of color, wasn't just surprising. It wasn't just incriminating. It was devastating. It wasn't supposed to exist. It wasn't supposed to be shared. And it certainly wasn't supposed to end up in the hands of the Princess of Wales at 2:13 a.m. So let's start with the question that matters most. How did this recording come to be? The palace has always been a fortress of privacy, a labyrinth where conversations disappear into the walls, a place where every word spoken carries weight and risk. But even in a fortress, there are cracks, and this recording slipped through one of those cracks. It all began earlier in the week. Long before the crisis erupted, when a senior aide began noticing something unsettling, conversations happening in low voices, unusual meetings behind closed doors, a shift in tone among members of Camilla's inner circle, an atmosphere that felt less like cooperation and more like plotting. At first, the aide kept quiet. Palace politics can be brutal, and loyalty is often rewarded more than honesty. But something didn't sit right. And as the tension between Camilla and Catherine grew more visible, the aide started paying attention. Close attention. Then came the moment that changed everything. A corridor. A half-open door. 2 voices. A conversation dripping with contempt. Not toward the monarchy, not toward the king, but toward Catherine herself. The aide froze, listening. Not out of curiosity, out of alarm. Because the tone wasn't professional. It wasn't frustrated. It wasn't a harmless venting session. It was strategic, coordinated, mean-spirited. There were phrases like, public sympathy has made her arrogant, and she'll never see what we're planning. Phrases that suggested an agenda. Phrases that crossed a line. And then, the worst one. She needs to be put back in her place. Stop for a moment. Reflect on that. In a household built on hierarchy and respect, where every gesture is choreographed and every comment considered, a line like that is nuclear. It was enough to make the aide step backward instinctively, heart racing. But they didn't leave. Something told them to stay, to listen, to pay attention. And that's when they heard the final blow, the line that would eventually trigger the Dawn emergency order. If the king won't act, we will find a way. Find a way. Those 3 words were chilling enough on their own. But paired with the tone in which they were spoken, it became clear this wasn't just gossip. It was intention. The aide quietly activated a secure recorder, a device used only in extreme circumstances when palace stability may be threatened. Not because they wanted to expose anyone, not because they were playing spy, not because they had an agenda, but because they were terrified of what they were hearing. The recording captured 8 minutes of conversation. 8 minutes that would later become the catalyst for the biggest royal shift in a generation. Afterward, the aide faced a choice. Say nothing. Or deliver the recording to someone who could stop whatever was brewing. They hesitated. They debated. They feared losing their job, or worse, their standing. But ultimately, they made a choice that would change everything. They sent the recording through a secure channel to an advisor aligned with Catherine. They didn't attach a message. They didn't explain themselves. They didn't even name the participants. They simply wrote, "You need to hear this." And Catherine did. Now imagine being Catherine in that moment. It's late. The palace is dark. You've already been pulled into a confidential briefing. You've seen troubling information. You're already trying to piece together what's happening. And then, a recording lands in your hands. She presses play. At first, she doesn't react. Her posture remains straight. Her breathing controlled. Her face unreadable. But inside, something cracks. Because Catherine isn't just a royal. She isn't just a public figure. She isn't just a future queen. She is human. And hearing her name spoken with such hostility, hearing plans being discussed behind her back, hearing people within the palace targeting her, that hits differently. Witnesses say Catherine's reaction wasn't anger, wasn't fear, wasn't sadness. It was disappointment. Deep, heavy disappointment. She didn't ask who recorded it. She didn't ask how it was obtained. She didn't ask who was involved. Her first question was, "Has the king heard this?" The advisor shook their head. Catherine said, "He needs to." But before that could happen, something complicated everything. Camilla stormed into the West Wing that same hour, emotional, angry, demanding answers, demanding meetings, demanding to know why she had been excluded from conversations. She didn't know about the recording. Not yet. But her behavior only confirmed what the recording suggested: instability, irrationality, a dangerous emotional escalation. Catherine didn't approach her, didn't confront her, didn't engage. Instead, she stayed silent, stayed focused, stayed calm, because Catherine understood one thing Camilla did not. This wasn't about her. This was about the crown, and the crown cannot afford chaos. Now we return to Charles. When the recording finally reached him, nearly an hour after Catherine heard it, the king was already rattled from Camilla's confrontation. He needed clarity. He needed truth. He needed proof. And then, he got it. He played the recording once, then again, then a third time. Each time, his posture grew stiffer, his eyes darker, his jaw tighter, until finally, he pressed stop. The room was silent. The recorder clicked. Charles placed both hands on the desk and whispered, "Enough." Because for Charles, this wasn't just palace drama. It was betrayal. A betrayal of Catherine. A betrayal of royal unity. A betrayal of the stability he had fought to maintain. There's a detail the public never heard. Charles didn't get angry first. He got hurt. Not because the comments targeted Catherine, but because they came from someone close. Someone trusted. Someone connected to his wife. He felt blindsided. He felt foolish. He felt used. And worst of all, he felt that the monarchy itself was becoming compromised by internal politics, the very thing he had spent decades trying to eliminate. So he made a decision, not impulsively, not emotionally, not out of revenge, out of necessity. He would remove the problem, not by firing staff, though that would come later, not by reprimanding Camilla, though confrontation was inevitable. No, he would solve the crisis by stabilizing the institution, and the only person capable of stabilizing it was Catherine. But before the king took action, another twist emerged. The aide who recorded the conversation was identified. Quietly, internally, without public alarm, not to punish them, but to verify their motive. And what they revealed shocked even the most seasoned palace investigators. They said, "I did it because I was scared for her." Her meaning Catherine. Her meaning the Princess of Wales. Her meaning the woman who, ironically, would never want harm to come to anyone, even those who plotted against her. This revelation sealed everything. It proved the intent behind the recording wasn't malicious. It wasn't political. It wasn't part of a scheme. It was an act of protection. And Charles, uncharacteristically emotional, reportedly thanked the aide directly. Now the king faced a new truth. The threat wasn't external. The instability wasn't coming from the press or foreign governments. It was coming from inside the palace, inside Camilla's circle, inside the queen consort's own wing. And Charles knew what that meant. He could either allow the tension to fester until it eroded public faith in the monarchy, or he could strike swiftly, decisively, and painfully. He chose the latter. But before the emergency orders were prepared, Charles did something unexpected. He asked to hear the recording one more time. Just once. Not to doubt it. Not to analyze it. Not to reconsider. But to confirm his conviction. After the final listening, he said only, "Transfer the powers." And with that, the night transformed into the dawn emergency. However, there's one question left hanging in the air. Who was the second voice in the recording? The quieter voice? The agreeing voice? The voice that validated the more aggressive speaker? Because that identity, that detail, still hadn't been revealed to Charles. Not yet. And when it was, it would shake him more than the recording itself. Because the second voice belonged to someone far closer to Camilla than anyone anticipated. Someone who would betray her before the night was over. But that story, that unraveling, is waiting in the next chapter. Because the biggest shock wasn't what was said, but where Camilla was the moment the recording was made. And what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. To understand the full impact of the recording, we must focus on one question the king kept asking after hearing it. Where was Camilla when this was made? It haunted him. It gnawed at him. It pushed him toward a decision he never imagined making. Because if Camilla was nearby, in the same wing or in the adjoining room, then the implications were devastating. But if she wasn't nearby? If the recording happened behind her back, among people she trusted, people she confided in, then the betrayal was even more complex. And either possibility was dangerous. So Charles demanded to know, what was her location at the time? Security scrambled to check logs, radio communications, door data, camera footage, and what they found only deepened the crisis. At the time the recording was made, 6:12 p.m. earlier that day, Camilla was unaccounted for. Now, understand something important. Senior royals are rarely unaccounted for. Their movements are tracked, not for control, but for protection. But at 6:12 p.m., Camilla's whereabouts were listed as location, indeterminate. Last confirmed, 5:48 p.m. Status, not in monitored rooms. Estimated, off-grid within the residence. Off-grid. That word sliced through the palace like a blade. Because nobody goes off-grid in Windsor Castle by accident. This meant one of two things, both equally alarming. Option 1. She was meeting someone privately in an unmonitored location. Option 2. She deliberately removed herself from security oversight. Either scenario was a nightmare for the king. And at that exact time, 6:12 p.m., the recording captured two voices targeting Catherine. So now we arrive at a chilling possibility. Either Camilla was involved in the conversation indirectly, through orchestration, or she was oblivious. Meaning the toxicity was festering inside her circle without her knowledge. Both options were catastrophic. Now remember, Catherine didn't jump to conclusions. She didn't accuse. She didn't dramatize. She simply said one sentence after hearing the recording. This cannot be ignored. And that is why Charles reacted the way he did. But the king's emotional spiral wasn't triggered solely by the content. It was triggered by the identity of the second voice. For nearly an hour, investigators tried to match it. They ran it through internal recognition systems. They compared it to known staff. They reviewed service rosters. Then, at 1:33 a.m., moments before Camilla's second disappearance, the truth came out. The second voice belonged to a royal aide who had worked closely with Camilla for nearly 5 years. Someone she trusted. Someone she defended publicly. Someone she relied on heavily for advice. When Charles learned this, he pressed his hands to his face. Imagine being a ruler, a husband, and a father, and learning that the people closest to your wife were conspiring behind palace walls, whether with or without her knowledge, to undermine your daughter-in-law. This wasn't palace intrigue anymore. It was a breach of trust, and not just trust in people. Trust in judgment. Trust in loyalty. Trust in stability. Charles said quietly, "I cannot lead a fractured household." This was the moment the emergency order became inevitable. But let's go deeper. Because the recording wasn't only about Catherine. At minute 5:17 of the audio, one of the voices said something so inflammatory, so dangerous, so reckless, that palace officials later described it as professionally suicidal. They said, "She'll crumble under pressure. She's too polished, too fragile. Once she breaks, The public will realize she's no queen. Catherine, fragile, breakable, unequal to the task. Those words cut Charles deeper than he let anyone see. Because Catherine, despite her elegance, her composure, her calm public persona, is not fragile. She endured press attacks for years. She navigated overwhelming scrutiny. She balanced motherhood, duty, and relentless expectation. She carried the future of the monarchy quietly, without complaint, without meltdown, without self-serving behavior. And hearing someone speak about her as if she were a pawn, a weak link, a piece to be removed, it infuriated the king. The part that came next was even worse. The two voices started discussing ways to limit her influence. Not sabotage in a treasonous sense, but subtle strategies, public framing, delegation rearrangements.